based on true events. Names have been changed to protect privacy. Sarah Mitchell had always believed in fairy tales, not the kind with dragons and magic spells, but the real-life kind where two people meet, fall in love, build a life together, and live happily ever after. For 12 years, she thought she was living in one. She met James at a coffee shop near the university where she was finishing her master's degree in education. He was already climbing the corporate ladder at a prestigious marketing firm, confident and charming in his tailored suits. Their courtship was like something out of a romantic movie: surprise dates, handwritten notes, and long conversations that stretched into the early morning hours. "You're going to change the world," James would tell her, his eyes shining with admiration as she talked about her dreams of becoming a teacher. And she believed him. More importantly, she believed in them. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony surrounded by family and friends. Sarah wore her grandmother's pearl necklace and carried white roses. James cried when she walked down the aisle. Everyone said they were perfect together. The ambitious businessman and the nurturing teacher, balancing each other perfectly. The first few years of marriage were everything Sarah had hoped for. James's career flourished, and he was promoted to senior marketing director. Sarah found her calling teaching 3rd grade at an elementary school in their neighborhood. They bought a beautiful colonial house with a white picket fence and a garden where Sarah grew tomatoes and sunflowers. "This is it," Sarah would think as she watched James mow the lawn on Saturday mornings, or when they cooked dinner together on weeknight evenings. "This is my happily ever after." When James told her about hiring a new executive assistant, Sarah was thrilled for him. His workload had become overwhelming, and she often worried about the long hours he was putting in. "Her name is Rebecca Chen," James explained over dinner one evening. "She just graduated from business school, very sharp, very organized. I think she's going to be a huge help." Sarah smiled and reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "That's wonderful, honey. You deserve all the support you can get." Rebecca was everything James had described and more. At 26, she was polished, intelligent, and strikingly beautiful in an effortless way that made Sarah feel frumpy in her teacher clothes. When James brought her to the company Christmas party that first year, Sarah tried to ignore the way Rebecca's hand lingered on James's arm when she laughed at his jokes, or how her eyes never quite met Sarah's when they were introduced. "She's very young," Sarah mentioned to James on the drive home. "She's brilliant," James replied, not taking his eyes off the road. "Age doesn't matter when someone has that kind of talent." Sarah nodded and tried to push away the uncomfortable feeling settling in her stomach. Over the next year, Rebecca's name began appearing in their conversations with increasing frequency. Rebecca had suggested a new client strategy. Rebecca had found an error in a presentation that could have been embarrassing. Rebecca had worked late to help James prepare for a big meeting. "You talk about her a lot," Sarah said one evening, trying to keep her voice light. James looked up from his laptop. "Do I? I guess she's just been really helpful lately. I don't know what I'd do without her." The words stung more than Sarah expected. When was the last time James had said he didn't know what he'd do without her? The changes started small. James began working later, leaving earlier, and taking more business trips. When Sarah would call his office, Rebecca would answer with a professional but slightly cold tone. "Mr. Mitchell is in a meeting. Can I take a message?" Sarah started noticing other things too. James had begun dressing differently. more expensive shirts, a new cologne, a haircut that made him look younger. He bought a gym membership and started working out religiously. "You look great," Sarah told him one morning, and she meant it. But there was something different in the way he carried himself, something that didn't include her. "Thanks," he said, barely looking up from his phone. "Rebecca suggested I try this new trainer, says it's important to stay in shape for client presentations." Rebecca again. The first real crack in Sarah's world came on a Tuesday evening in March. James had said he'd be working late on a proposal, but when Sarah drove past his office building at 8 p.m. to drop off the dinner he'd forgotten, the parking garage was nearly empty. His car wasn't there. She sat in her car for 20 minutes, staring at the empty parking space, trying to think of reasonable explanations. Maybe he'd gone out for a business dinner. Maybe he'd had to meet a client somewhere else. Maybe. When James came home at 11 p.m., he kissed her cheek and headed straight for the shower. "How was the proposal meeting?" Sarah asked when he emerged. "Exhausting," he said, not meeting her eyes. "We finally wrapped up around 10:30. Sarah nodded and smiled, but something cold had settled in her chest. The signs became harder to ignore. James would take phone calls in another room, speaking in hushed tones. He started password protecting his laptop and phone. When Sarah asked about weekend plans, he'd often have mysterious work commitments that hadn't been mentioned before. The worst part was how he looked at her, or rather, how he didn't. The man who once couldn't keep his hands off her now treated her like a roommate, polite but distant. Sarah began to feel like she was disappearing in her own marriage. The breaking point came on their 12th wedding anniversary. Sarah had made reservations at the restaurant where they'd had their first date, bought a new dress, and arranged for her sister to watch their neighbours' children so they could have an uninterrupted evening together. At 6 p.m., James called. "Sarah, I'm so sorry, but this client crisis came up. Rebecca and I are going to have to work through the evening to fix it. Can we reschedule?" Sarah stood in their bedroom, wearing her new dress, holding the anniversary card she'd spent an hour writing, and felt something break inside her. "Of course," she heard herself say, "these things happen, but they didn't just happen, they were chosen." That night, Sarah did something she'd never done before. She drove to James's office building and parked across the street. His car was there, along with Rebecca's silver BMW. The lights were on in his corner office on the 15th floor. At 9 p.m., she saw two silhouettes move across the window. They were standing close together, closer than any boss and assistant should be. Then, for just a moment, the silhouettes merged into one. Sarah drove home in a daze, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. The confrontation came 3 weeks later, and it wasn't planned. Sarah had been fighting a stomach bug and left school early. She decided to surprise James with lunch from his favourite deli, thinking maybe a gesture of kindness could bridge whatever gap had grown between them. She used her key to his office building, a privilege from the early days of their marriage when she would sometimes meet him for lunch dates. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt endless. She could hear voices from his office as she approached. James's laugh, and a woman's voice she recognized as Rebecca's. The door was slightly ajar. "We can't keep doing this," Rebecca was saying, but her voice was playful, not serious. "I know," James replied, "but I can't seem to stop myself when it comes to you." Sarah's hand froze on the door handle. "What about Sarah?" Rebecca asked. There was a pause that felt like an eternity. "Sarah is..." Sarah, James said finally, she's safe, predictable. She's the life I built, but you're the life I want. Sarah felt the world tilt. The deli bag slipped from her hands, the containers hitting the floor with a crash that echoed through the hallway. The voices inside the office stopped abruptly. Sarah turned and ran. She made it to her car before the tears came, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her soul. 12 years of marriage, of believing in fairy tales, of trusting the man she'd promised to love forever, all of it crumbling in the space of a few overheard words. When James came home that evening, Sarah was sitting at their kitchen table with divorce papers her lawyer friend had helped her print from the internet. "Sarah, we need to talk," he began, but she held up her hand. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "You need to listen." She told him about the office building, about the anniversary dinner, about all the small betrayals that had been eating away at her trust. She watched his face change from surprise to guilt to something that looked almost like relief. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said finally, "but it did happen, and you chose to let it keep happening." James sat down across from her, suddenly looking older than his 42 years. "Sarah, do you love her?" The question came out before Sarah could stop it. James was quiet for a long moment, then, almost inaudibly, "Yes." It was the most honest thing he'd said to her in months. "Then there's nothing left to discuss," Sarah said, sliding the divorce papers across the table. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. James married Rebecca 8 months after that, in a small ceremony that Sarah heard about through mutual friends. They didn't invite anyone from James's old life. Sarah kept the house. James didn't fight her on it, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps because it represented a life he no longer wanted. She painted the walls bright colors, planted new flowers in the garden, and slowly began to remember who she was before she became half of a couple. The hardest part wasn't the loneliness or the practical challenges of being single again. It was learning to trust her instincts after years of doubting them, of accepting reasonable explanations for unreasonable behavior. 2 years later, Sarah met David at a bookstore. He was browsing the education section, looking for materials for his daughter who was struggling with reading. Sarah helped him choose some books, and he asked her for coffee to thank her. "I should mention," he said over their second cup, "I'm divorced." "It's been 3 years, and I have full custody of my daughter. I know that's a lot of baggage." Sarah smiled, thinking about her own baggage, carefully unpacked and sorted through with the help of a good therapist. "I'm divorced too," she said, "and I've learned that everyone has a story. What matters is how honest you are about it." David nodded. "Complete honesty. I like that." As Sarah walked home that evening, she thought about fairy tales again. Maybe the real magic wasn't in living happily ever after with your first love. Maybe it was in surviving heartbreak, learning to trust again, and discovering that endings could also be beginnings. She still believed in love stories. She just understood now that sometimes the best ones start with the word again. And if you're experiencing betrayal in your relationship, remember that you deserve honesty and respect. Trust your instincts, seek support from friends and professionals, and know that healing is possible. Your story doesn't end with someone else's betrayal. It begins again with your courage to start over.